Thank you very much. Glad to be here and glad there is such an enthusiasm on soil carbon. I would introduce some of this just from my own sort of perspective and also introduce at the end the issues and questions that we have. First of all, if we look at the considerable challenge, some might say insurmountable, of achieving a 2-degree global temperature target, this can only, at least in my view, and I think that's also coming out of the IPCC assessment on the 2-degree, it can only be achieved if we can actually grab some of those CO2 emissions and store them somehow, either with carbon capture and storage, where we store it in geological formations, or by storing this in soils or vegetation. So this is part of the essential solutions to achieving a 2-degree target. Just to show why we come up with the numbers we do. To the left, up to the upper left there, you see those increasing emissions of CO2, primarily from fossil fuels. We've also got a bit from land use change. That's not really been changing, rather declining over time. And to the right, you see how those emissions, where they end up, so to speak. We've got the atmosphere, we've got the terrestrial biosphere, and we've got the oceans. And the CO2 ends up in all of those. Increasingly so, however, in the atmosphere. But we've still got a considerable sink size on land. It's not increasing as much. This is what we would like it to do, actually. We would like that land sink would become greater. And that is, as I understand, very much what the 4 per thousand is about. Now, if we look at how much currently atmospheric CO2 is increasing, it's about 17.2 gigatons of CO2. If you convert that to carbon, it's 4.7 gigatons. Almost the same number comes up here in the 4 per thousand, slightly lower. Maybe it's an older number that was taken here. And since that atmospheric CO2 is increasing, this also is increasing. However, if we take the 4.3 gigatons and look at how much that makes out of the total soil carbon, we end up at those 4 per thousand as the goal to increase. Now, what can we do? Well, in terms of enhancing this, it's about sequestering, of course, carbon. This can really primarily be done by adding more carbon. It's over time being debated whether you can maintain some of the carbon you have there, maybe by not so intensively cultivate soils or by preserving in other ways carbon there. I'll come back to this issue. But of course here, by adding more carbon, we've got the competition that Pete Smith was also a bit alluding to, competition with other uses of that carbon in primarily for food, feed, fiber, and biofuels. We can't really use that carbon twice, or seldom actually. In some cases we might. So we need to think about carefully the use of carbon. There's another issue, and that's the permanency of carbon in our soils. That carbon that we add to soils get degraded, decomposed by organisms in the soil. That's part of the functioning, actually, of the carbon, but of adding energy to those organisms. We can only slow that down, really, in many cases by raising the water table, which often would slow down this decomposition. So we need measures. If we put measures in place that enhance carbon, we need to keep them going over time. These are measures that if we implement them, we need to continue. And another considerable challenge we will be facing is that temperatures are increasing. We will not stop this temperature increase over the next few decades. We will see increasing temperatures, and those increasing temperatures will also have impacts on those organisms in soil. They will speed up the decomposition, thus reducing the carbon we have. It's been estimated that a 1 degree temperature increase would reduce that soil carbon by 1.6 gigatons. So maybe taking away a bit, about a third or so, maybe, of what we would like to enhance. So this is actually challenging because we are trying to enhance this soil carbon against a competition from other uses of that carbon and from the background of higher temperatures actually decreasing soil carbon. This is not to discourage the 4 per thousand initiative. This just, I think, strengthens the need to work on these issues. Yeah. So, I mean, you can. I'm just trying to do some math here. So, if we consider that average soil carbon content to be about 160 tons of carbon per hectare, this is a required sequestration rate then of 0.6. How would we achieve that? But if we were to say, okay, this means we need to enhance input, and if we assume that of that enhanced input, roughly 15%, this is a guesstimate of mine, would be humified. So stay there in a medium-term perspective at least. This would mean we needed to add 4 tons per hectare annually in carbon in the biomass. If you convert that to dry matter, it's 9 tons of carbon. No, sorry, of biomass, which is a substantial amount. So we need to start thinking, where does that come from? Because essentially, if we don't want to harvest less, we need to increase productivity or production so that we can have more staying out there. And there are ways to do this. Cover crops is one way of having this. Also, of course, not harvesting straw is another way. Managing maybe grassland or converting some of the arable to grassland is another way. All of these estimates that I've shown here is for topsoil. We have little or less consolidated data on subsoil, something that I think we really need to work on. So requirements to meet this challenge is we need to increase productivity and leave more of the carbon to the soil. We also need to see if we can return resilient carbon. Some of the more resilient is what we have in wastes and manures and so on, compost, but we could also go all the way to biochar. And of course, retaining crop residues in the field is another issue. Equally important is to make sure that the large carbon stocks we have out there already, that we maintain them. This is particularly relevant for peatlands. Peatlands are in many parts of the world being drained for agricultural land use, with resulting in considerable, if not huge, emissions. The easiest way, actually, to achieve some of this 4 per thousand would be to make sure this is stopped and that you do your cultivation of crops elsewhere. Another thing is, of course, deforestation, grassland conversions. And then when all of that is done, we can start thinking about what can we enhance the carbon stocks where we do have them. And I've already mentioned some of that. But I would just caution that it's not just about carbon. It's also about other nutrients, because the soil organic matter is composed not just of carbon, but of nitrogen, of phosphorus, of sulfur. There is no way we, in the longer term, or maybe even medium term, can enhance soil organic carbon without making sure the other nutrients follow. Just to illustrate this, this was from an excellent, sorry, the reference went out at the bottom. This is an excellent slide from a PhD student that presented her thesis at INRA, Benedicta Autrey, last week. She looked at some long-term experiments in various parts of Europe. And to the left, you can see how soil organic carbon is changing in carbon per hectare per year versus the carbon input. There is some relation with the carbon input. As you can see, they don't all follow on the same line. When we do compare, instead, as she did here, those changes in carbon against the nitrogen surplus, things become really, really very clear. We have a relationship where we can only enhance that carbon if we also have a positive nitrogen surplus. So we are adding more nitrogen to the system than we remove, and also beyond the losses we have. We can even see if we take the slope of this line, how much carbon we add per unit of surplus, that this doesn't really follow the relationship we would be assuming here of 1 to 10 or 1 to 11. It's less, indicating that when we have those higher surpluses, we have additional losses of nitrogen, some of which would come as nitrous oxide, thus giving emissions of another greenhouse gas. So this tells us another thing, is that some of the measures we're doing to enhance carbon might come at costs for other greenhouse gases, which is something we should also be very much aware of. So the issues here, of course, is to contribute positively to the greenhouse gas balance, considering also the other greenhouse gases. But there's another, and that's also been raised here, equally important issue, is how does soil carbon, soil organic matter contribute to soil functioning and the productivity? It is worthwhile saying that many of these issues are not properly currently included in the way farmers manage soils or the way policies and so on are designed. Of course, this is also what this initiative is about, bringing change into. So these issues is going to be discussed also in those stakeholder groups we have here. We have, as we've been seeing, some lack of scientific understanding of what the functioning of organic matter, carbon, and so on are. We have issues in terms of quantifying effectiveness of carbon management, both for topsoil and subsoil. We have the issue of how that management is being understood by farmers, how policymakers understand this, maybe in particular from an ecosystem services perspective. And we have barriers to adoption, which depends on technical, financial, and many, many other issues. And of course, incentives to do this properly is strongly needed. I won't go too much into detail with this, but this just illustrating that carbon affects functioning of soils and effects on crop productivity in rather complicated ways. And there is not one, I think, unified way to say how this will work out in any particular site, because, as you can see here, water, nutrient, health aspects of soils are all directly or indirectly being affected by both the soil carbon as such, but also the way we manage it. We can, if you go into literature, you can find relationships between crop productivity and soil carbon, just such as the one we have here. Pete Smith was also co-author of this one, so we cannot blame him for parts of it. I think the issue here, this is from China, looking at crop yield versus soil carbon in various provinces of China, and which we have to the left and to the right. It's about yield variability, also seemingly being linked to this. But one can actually start asking the question, when we find these kind of relationships, what is the cause and what is the effect here? Is it the carbon that's affecting the crop productivity, or is the productivity that affects the carbon? So probably both. So we could start thinking about what is the relationship here. And one way to look at it in terms of a crop yield is typically we have relationships between how we manage crops in terms of input intensity. This could be fertilizer, pesticides, tillage, irrigation, whatever. We have many different factors we affect crop productivity by. And then we can start thinking, how would carbon be affecting this? Something we always think is, okay, it gives us a higher yield as such that we cannot substitute with input. But the other thing we might have is we have a shift of that curve so that we can do with less input when we have more fertile soils that have higher carbon inputs. And in fact, both relationships, both effects may occur in practice. This is a recent study that looked at experiments over Europe, and I won't go into all of the details here, but this slide is looking at that effect of the higher productivity. So the yield at the sort of maximum input. And what you can see here, we have some cases where we actually enhance that yield potential. But in the end, of course, this depends on how this is being understood by farmers. And whether this actually is, these measures are being adopted, which involves engaging farmers, involves having farmers having the willingness to change, so that depends on various types of barriers, and also capacity, of course, to do so, for which we might provide assistance somehow. I would just finish with coming up with just a few thoughts on principles that we developed in the European project, the Smart Soil project. And I think this is worth just going through and worth keeping in mind. If we look at soil organic carbon, this is sustained through organic matter inputs in roots, in crop residues, in manure, in compost, and so on. And this is to outbalance, of course, the decomposition that we have of that existing soil organic matter. Soil organic matter contributes to many functions of soils, but also to productivity of crops, in particular by enhancing soil water retention and the crop nutrient supply. It also contributes to soil structure and soil workability. And all of these, of course, are also something that then reduces the need for inputs. In addition, we have the contribution to soil biodiversity, which also have effects in our agricultural systems by, in some cases, reducing the needs for controlling pests. And in other cases, you might actually have a higher need, because in some cases the management that you apply to have this would actually enhance maybe diseases or pests. So this is, there are some trade-offs here, and you would need to manage things very much according to local conditions. Soil organic matter and carbon management is a long-term activity. You need to be in there for the long term if this is going to be effective. As such, it needs to be integrated into the nutrient management, both at field and farm scale, if this is to be effective. So, this also needs to be managed according to what is the current status of the soil, taking into account the current carbon levels, maybe also the other aspects of soils with physical, chemical characteristics. There's been issues also around what you can do in terms of changing tillage, cultivation, intensive cultivation, and of course combining higher inputs of organic matter in residues and so on with reduced tillage allows one much more quickly to build a higher carbon content in the upper surface layers of the soil, where often we would need it most for the biodiversity and for the soil structural issues. And this is where having that consideration of also being aware of the other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, as being important, because otherwise in the longer term or even maybe medium term we wouldn't be able to enhance carbon. And this is the last of the 7 ones. We only will have full benefit of this if we have a solid integrated agroecological management of this that also considers how we manage other aspects such as weeds, pests and diseases. And all of this needs, of course, to be adapted to local soil, climatic conditions and to the specific farming systems. And this is when I come to the questions to be discussed in the breakout groups. They come in 3, as you can see here. One is, how can this 4 per thousand initiative facilitate action at all levels, and which action is it we should prioritize? And as an actor or colleague to this, how would you invest to move to action? What interventions should be prioritized? And then thinking of that, what are the conditions that can boost or slow actions? Of course, we would like to boost them and avoid the slow ones. But it is important to classify. So we'd like to classify classify conditions, environmental elements, with those two things in your mind: what boosts versus what slows. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah.